From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do sign up at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening. This week, peace in our time. President Trump is in the midst of a flurry of diplomatic activity in a bid to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Last week, he spoke with Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, and, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat down with his Russian counterpart in Saudi Arabia, the first high-level in-person meeting between the two countries since the war started. This week, Trump met with French President Emmanuel Macron, and on Thursday, he welcomes British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, all, of course, to talk about the war and how to end it. And on Tuesday this week, the United States and Ukraine inked a deal that would give the US access to a share of Ukrainian mineral reserves. And on Monday, the United States voted with Russia and its allies, including states such as North Korea and Belarus, against a United Nations General Assembly resolution that did blame Russia for the invasion itself. Trump promised to end the war in Ukraine last year as he campaigned for the presidency. So where is all this diplomatic activity heading? Is the US, in effect, abandoning Ukraine? Is it siding now with Russia in what some see as a major strategic shift by the country? Is this commercial deal that it may be getting, is this part of a broader US approach to diplomacy and to dealing with its interests around the world? Or is there something more going on? Could we be about to see perhaps some kind of grand bargain with all the parties involved that could bring at least a temporary halt to the war that passed its 3-year anniversary this week? Well, this week I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Fred Kagan. Welcoming him back to the program. Fred's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a former professor of military history at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's the author of several books and scholarly articles, and he contributes to the regular updates on the war in Ukraine that is produced by the Institute for the Study of War. Fred Kagan joins me now. Fred, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
It's great to be with you.
Fred, I want to talk about the flurry of diplomatic activity that we've seen in the last couple of weeks that I mentioned in my introduction. But can we start with, because you don't know anyone better to give us an assessment of this because you're studying this in detail, just give us a sense of where we are in the war right now. There's been, obviously, we passed the 3-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine this week. The war has kind of ebbed and flowed over that 3-year period. Early gains by the Russians, then repulsed by Ukraine. Ukraine seemed to be making some progress. Then it was settling into what looked like a kind of a stalemate. Towards the end of last year, Russia seemed to be making some progress. Ukraine, obviously, has moved into some parts of Russian territory. It does seem that still things seem to be, if not exactly stalemated, then there isn't significant movement on the ground. But you tell us, what's the latest balance of forces and the latest state of the military activity?
So thank you so much, and thanks for starting with that, because we do need to remember that this is a war. And I think that we're sometimes losing sight of that in all of these diplomatic discussions here. So what's gone on is that the Russians, about a year ago, launched a massive offensive operation all along eastern Ukraine. And they tried to launch an additional big offensive operation in Kharkiv as well. And they have thrown a huge amount of resources into that, and they've taken close to 500,000 casualties in that effort. And what is most remarkable is that the lines haven't moved all that much, despite the huge energy the Russians have put into it and the huge costs they have suffered. That's very important, Gerry, because it shows the degree to which the Ukrainians are able to stave off the larger Russian military and the more powerful Russia and so forth, even at a time when the U.S. had suspended aid deliveries. The Ukrainians were under all kinds of pressure from the standpoint of the slow deliveries of Western aid and the tensions with the election and so forth. And even amidst all of that, the Ukrainians have been able to prevent the Russians from making any truly significant gains here. Now, wars settle into positional stages like this where there's not a whole lot of motion, but then they also can move out of these positional phases. And the thing that it's most important for us to understand is there's nothing stable about this phase. If the U.S. stops providing assistance to Ukraine, if the Europeans either don't keep providing what they're providing or fill in any gaps that the U.S. might leave, then the Russians may very well be able to push forward and start turning this war into a more dynamic thing in a very, very negative way. On the flip side, given the resources the Russians have expended, and the Russians, this is not the Soviet Union, whatever Putin wants you to believe. The Russians do not have limitless resources to throw. In fact, they're going to come into some very serious limitations this year. If the West were actually to step up and start providing Ukraine more of what it needs, there's a possibility that the Ukrainians themselves could begin to restore some maneuver here and begin to liberate some critically important territories, which I might add include territories with some of the mineral resources that President Trump is so interested in.
Let's look at that in detail. So right now, we read that Russia is in occupation of roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory. Is that about right?
Yes.
And as you say, there's not been huge movement despite the big Russian offensive last year. What's the state of the Ukrainian military right now? We understand, of course, that there are some fairly significant leads and lags in getting the military equipment that the US has already approved and that other NATO countries have already approved. And it looks like there won't be any more authorization for further US military assistance to Ukraine. But if there's no more coming from the US, what's the state of equipment, of readiness of Ukraine's forces? And sort of give us a sense of how long they would be, say, sufficiently equipped to continue to hold the Russians back or even to make advances. And what could we expect over the next few months?
Well, I think we've seen reports that President Biden put aid in the pipeline that will continue to flow through this year, actually, if President Trump allows it to, and that is already accounted for in the U.S. expenditures, and that aid should be sufficient to help Ukraine fight through this summer. Beyond that, there are systems that only the U.S. can provide that Ukraine desperately needs. Patriot anti-missile systems, first and foremost, but there are some other capabilities that the U.S. is providing that other allies are not able to substitute. So the question becomes, I think everyone recognizes that President Trump is not going to authorize another grant or gift of aid to Ukraine. The question is, will he allow Ukraine or European countries to purchase U.S. weapons that are necessary and provide them to Ukraine? And this is a question I think President Zelensky has just said, excellent report in the Journal, that he will be asking. If the answer to that question is yes, then, the Ukrainians can be okay here. If the answer is no, then they're going to run into some very serious problems. That's on the side of the Western equipment. I think the other thing that we need to recognize, though, and this is getting too often lost, is that Ukraine is very unlike the other partners that the U.S. has supported in previous wars, in that Ukraine has a defense industrial base. Ukraine is producing a large proportion of the war material that it is using. And very specifically, of course, Ukraine is leading the world in the production use of advanced drones, with which it has been in the process of transforming war. And that is a big part of the secret to why they've been able to hold off the Russian gains. So it's important, as we talk about what Ukraine offers in the future, that we move beyond the discussion of mineral resources and we recognize the value of the Ukrainian military that is being built over the long term as a force that can deter future Russian aggression and that can help secure NATO and reduce ultimately the costs and risks that NATO and the United States will have to bear.
What about the condition of the Russian forces? You mentioned that since their offensive a year ago, they've sustained 500,000 casualties. I've seen numbers for the total Russian losses and killed in action and injured of maybe 1 million in all. Obviously, they've resorted to getting North Koreans to fight on their behalf. I've seen some reporting just in the last couple of days that they're offering significant kind of bounties to 50 and 60-plus-year-old men in their 70s to go and fight, astonishingly. That doesn't sound like a war machine that is in great shape. What's your assessment of it?
No, it isn't in great shape. And in fact, the Institute for the Study of War published recently a terrific paper by Christina Harward, one of the analysts there, laying out the challenges that Putin is going to have this year. It does seem that the Russians are coming toward the end of what they're going to be able to generate with this voluntary, financially induced crypto mobilization, as we call it. And Putin may very well have to resort to another compulsory reserve call-up, which he really doesn't want to do and which will really aggravate a lot of Russians. And he has an additional problem. It's easy to look at the Russian population compared to the Ukrainian population and say Putin, has all the men he needs. He doesn't. He is already at the point where he has to make choices about how many men he's going to put in the army and how many he's going to have to work in his defense industrial base. The Russians have not been able to mobilize their defense industrial base fully. Part of that is because they are facing a massive labor shortage, estimated some time ago as close to 5 million person labor shortage. Putin had originally been intending to address that through migrant labor, but a series of problems, some of his own making, some exogenous, have led to the sharp curtailing of the flow of migrant workers into Russia, which is really exacerbating this problem. As a result of that and other things, including Western sanctions, the Russians are not able to produce the military equipment that they need to continue fighting this war. They are losing tanks on the battlefield much more rapidly than they can produce or repair them. The same thing with armored personnel carriers and other vehicles. And in fact, we've actually seen a reduction in the general Russian use of armor across the battlefield over the course of the past several months. Partly it's clear simply because they're running out of vehicles. And they've been relying on Soviet-era stockpiles and trying to repair from those, but they're really coming to the end of that. And those are, as we might say, a non-renewable resource. Once they've done everything they can with those, they're on to whatever production they actually have, and that's not sufficient. This isn't something they're going to be able to fix rapidly, if they can fix it at all. It's also, one should add, something that the Iranians can't help with at all because they don't actually have armored vehicles. The North Koreans, I suppose, could give them some armored vehicles, but we might then be treated to the wonderful spectacle of seeing T-34s on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Yeah, that would be quite a spectacle. In a lengthy exchange with the historian and previous guest on this podcast, Neil Ferguson, Vice President J.D. Vance this week tried to sort of explain what his thinking and the administration's thinking behind what was going on. One of the things he said, Fred, was, quote, directly, Russians have a massive numerical advantage in manpower and weapons in Ukraine, and that advantage will persist regardless of further Western aid packages. And again, he says the aid is currently flowing. And he said elsewhere, of course, that neither Europe nor the Biden administration nor the Ukrainians have any pathway to victory. What do you make of that?
Well, that's not true. Yes, the Russian population is larger than Ukraine's. As I've just said, though, it's a lot more complicated than that. And Ukraine is able to draw on the defense industrial base of the entire Western world, at least for now, as well as Asian partners, whereas the Russians have a much more restricted set of partners with much more limited capabilities apart from the Chinese, who have shown that they're not interested in leaning into really providing the Russians with the kind of support that they would need. So this one-to-one straightforward comparison, if it were just Ukraine fighting Russia, then yeah, but it isn't. And beyond that, yes, first of all, the Ukrainian army is larger than the Russian army in Ukraine. Okay, that is a fact. There are more Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine than there are Russians. So it's not like the Russians have some vast numerical advantage in Ukraine itself. The Russian numerical advantage is that they can continue generating manpower, in principle, longer and at a larger scale. In practice, Putin is choosing not to do that. And there are very real constraints, as I said, even in those choices because of the challenges that he faces in terms of industry. The Ukrainians also have a reserve of people that they could mobilize that they have not yet mobilized because of the complexities of their mobilization laws. So they're still not conscripting in an age group that most countries would conscript in, from 18 to 25. So Ukraine is not running out of men either. The West can choose to have no pathway to victory. If we continue to restrict what we provide Ukraine, if we continue what was frankly the Biden administration policy of giving Ukraine just enough not to lose, then we can have no pathway to victory. Or we could decide that we were going to lean in, and in this case I'm speaking particularly to Europeans right now, could decide that they were going to lean in and give the Ukrainians a lot more of what they need, in which case we absolutely could see a path toward at least a much improved situation and something that could lead to a durable, sustainable peace that is in all of our interests.
I do want to get onto this diplomatic flurry that we've seen in the last week too, but just on this issue of, what could plausibly be achieved with continuing to prosecute the war. I take your point and everything you've said about, this better than anyone about the relative condition of the Russian and Ukrainian military is valid. But this is a war that's been going on for 3 years and does seem to be, and maybe again this is just a false impression, and I know these things can change as well quickly, but it does seem to be stalemated, and there has been massive loss of life on both sides. On the Russian side, military loss of life; on the Ukrainian side, military, and of course significant civilian loss of life, not to mention the millions of refugees. While everything you've said may be true, it isn't actually there a pretty strong case for saying, look, and by the way, all of that is the case between the US and the European members of NATO, and Canada have contributed, it's in the range of $300+ billion in a combination of military and financial support to Ukraine. It does look to a lot of people, it's understandable, isn't it, that people say, what is really going to be achieved by continuing to fight this? And actually, doesn't it make sense to try at least to get some sort of a ceasefire and to work from there? Because this war looks a little bit like the trench warfare of the First World War, doesn't it?
Not really. In truth, it doesn't really look much like that at all.
The lines have not significantly moved, right?
The lines have not moved, but the war itself doesn't look like World War I at all. There were structural factors in World War I that really made it impossible to move for a time. There are fun facts about the World War. You know, World War I ended as a war of maneuver.
When did it end?
1918.
Right.
The stalemates were broken. The Germans first broke through and made very rapid gains in the Michael offensives.
Right.
And then the Allies, using tanks, actually turned it back into a war of maneuver, which is what persuaded the Germans to surrender. And of course, on the Eastern Front, it never was stalemated. So yes, there was a long period in World War I when it was absolutely stalemated, didn't move, but it actually ended as a war of maneuver. So I think we can carry these historical stereotypes too far as well. And this is a real danger here, because again, if the West mishandles this badly enough, this will turn back into a war of maneuver very much in Russia's favor, which will be devastating. Look, the only person who is actually really invested in continuing this war at this point is Vladimir Putin. And Ukrainians want the war to end. Zelensky wants the war to end. We want the war to end. The person who doesn't want the war to end is Vladimir Putin, who is not given the slightest indication that he is willing to accept any end to this war other than the total capitulation of Ukraine. And he and his officials are continuing to repeat what their demands are, and their demands are for the total capitulation of Ukraine. They phrase it differently from periodically, but that's what they're insisting on. So it's not as if we have two sides here who have decided that this is hopeless and it's stalemated and we should just freeze the lines. Neither is it the case that the current lines will produce a stable and enduring peace in the context that we are living in which Putin is not willing to accept this outcome. Putin didn't lose 1 million men in order to gain the territory he now has. He fought this war in order to conquer Ukraine. He hasn't changed his view. So the question is not whether we want peace. Of course we want peace. The question is, do we want a peace that has any chance of actually enduring? Or are we prepared to say, well, we're tired of supporting the Ukrainians fighting, so we're just going to settle for a peace that in all likelihood will lead before very long to another massive Russian invasion and another huge war. That's not in anyone's interest. So there's a straw man argument that's being presented here that says, that people we don't want, of course we all want peace. We want a peace that is actually in our interests and a peace that actually can last.
So let's see how we might get to that. It does look as though in this quick flurry of diplomatic activity the US has done, we had Pete Hegseth coming out 2 weeks ago ahead of the Munich Security Conference, essentially, it seemed, giving up several critical elements in any negotiation, saying that most of the territory that Russia already had wasn't going to go back to Ukraine, saying that Ukraine would not be a member of NATO, and saying that the United States would not be part of any security force. Now, he kind of walked that back a little bit. The original statement sounded rather more convincing than the walking back. And after all, once you've offered that up in advance of a negotiation, I'm not really sure how you do walk that back. But what's your sense of what the administration is looking for? When we can talk about this minerals deal. Zelensky's coming to Washington, supposedly, I think, to talk about this deal, but obviously to have a wider conversation. The Europeans have been very much engaged. Macron was here from France on Monday. Keir Starmer from Britain arrives on Thursday. As these discussions go on, and thinking about what that first kind of opening move, as it were, if you can call it that Hegseth came out with, what do you make of the administration's strategy here in terms of bringing about even just a temporary peace?
Look, a lot of people are opining about how the Trump administration is handling this. I don't especially feel like adding my voice to that too much. I think it's generally unwise to be tossing out concessions in ahead of negotiations, even if you take them back. I think President Trump has articulated in general terms a desire for a peace that will be enduring. And I think that is what we should be aiming at. I think that an enduring peace has to have certain characteristics, and among them have to be solid and binding security arrangements between Ukraine and some of its key supporters. And I see that the U.S. administration appears to have been encouraging Europeans to do that and encouraging Ukrainians to do that. That would be a key part of it. No one wants to talk about changes in the front lines. That's a problem, because I'm here to tell you as a military expert that the front lines are not sustainable and are not suitable for an enduring peace. So we do need to have a conversation about where the front lines would be, and a ceasefire along current lines would be problematic. But we need to recognize that the Russians have explicitly and repeatedly rejected every single one of the things I have just said. They have said that they will not tolerate security guarantees for Ukraine. They will not tolerate Western aid to Ukraine. They will not even accept a ceasefire on current lines. They are demanding that Ukraine cede large territories that Russian forces do not even occupy now. So the problem that we have, and this is what we need to hear more about, is that for some time, and this went back to the Biden administration, the discussion was about how do we press Ukraine to make concessions? Okay, well, Zelensky has made concessions. Our problem is how do we get Putin to make concessions? And what is the leverage that we're bringing to bear on Putin? The best leverage we have to bring to bear on Putin is to help Ukraine inflict military setbacks on Russian forces in Ukraine and make Putin realize that he cannot achieve his aims by force and he cannot achieve them at all. Because right now, Putin still thinks that he can. And as long as Putin thinks that he can achieve a victory in Ukraine by force or else by talking us into surrendering Ukraine, he will persist. And the only way that we're going to get to any kind of a deal that anyone should accept is by convincing Putin without any question that he cannot achieve his aims and that he will suffer increasing military defeat if he continues to fight the war. That's what we need to be focused on.
And we're not doing that right now. We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Fred Kagan, military historian. We're talking about the war in Ukraine and what may be some kind of possibility that may be emerging for a peace settlement. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm talking to Fred Kagan, military historian, about the war in Ukraine, and we're looking at the prospects for a peace deal. In terms of the security, and again, I understand, as you said, that Putin has rejected everything that you've mentioned has been talked about so far, although one has to say, presumably in a negotiation, maybe these things are negotiable. Again, whatever sort of a ceasefire, truce, whatever kind of arrangement may be reached, the Europeans, particularly the British, have talked about a security force, a European-led security force that would enforce a security guarantee, but the British say it must have a US backstop. Now, again, I totally accept Putin has rejected that anyway and said he won't do it. But let's put that aside for a moment and say, maybe that is somehow the basis of at least some temporary ceasefire. Does it require US engagement in that? Again, something that Hexeth has ruled out. Or do the Europeans have the capability somehow, both military and perhaps arguably more important political capability, to assemble a force that would be sufficiently credible to maintain a security guarantee that would satisfy Ukraine? Do you have a sense of how that would work?
Well, I don't think anyone has a concrete sense of how it would work, and there would absolutely have to be some very serious conversations between European states that were going to do this in the U.S. in the context of the NATO commitments and so on, and how those would be viewed, because it's very important that the U.S. not take the position that if Europeans provide security guarantees to Ukraine that the U.S. has encouraged them to do, that we would then say, but if the Russians attack you, you're on your own. So that would need to be worked out. Look, what is clear to me is that a Ukrainian military that has achieved defensible borders and that the U.S. and the Europeans and the other supporters of Ukraine lean into supporting the stabilization and modernization expansion of the Ukrainian military and defense industrial base. And then the European states, particularly, we need to be explicit about this, European nuclear powers, France and the UK, provide security guarantees to Ukraine that make it clear to the Russians that if the Russians attack, they will be facing not only a strong Ukrainian military, which has been sufficient to beat them off here, but also European military intervention, then I think we are in a much stronger position to hope that a peace can be enduring. I think that that is feasible. But of course, there are a lot of complexities. And again, the Russians are not likely to give on this until they feel that they have been defeated. Yes, we can talk about, well, this is, what they say, but in negotiations, look, the Russian negotiation strategy is what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. That's how they negotiate. So we will need a lot of leverage on the Russians to get them to accept any kind of peace agreement that can possibly be enduring.
And as you say, that's really only going to come if we offer a plausible route for the Ukrainians to continue to inflict really significant damage on the Russians, right?
Yes.
I suppose part of the question is, if the US isn't going to do that, can you see, again, both in terms of actual sort of material capability, and I guess also in terms of political willingness, can you see the Europeans being able, you talked about Britain and France being nuclear powers, although, again, that raises the significant question of whether politically those countries would really want to put their kind of nuclear deterrent on the line, as it were, to defend Ukraine. If the US is not involved, if the US no longer continues to support Ukraine militarily, and if it says it's not going to get involved in any post-settlement security guarantee, just as a matter of practicality, do they have the capability somehow to do it themselves?
First of all, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that they extend a nuclear umbrella to Ukraine. It's important that there be nuclear powers involved so that the Russians can't simply threaten to nuke them straightforwardly if they get involved. We need the European nuclear deterrence to work as part of a shield for any European conventional intervention on behalf of Ukraine in a future war. I'm not suggesting that they say that they'll use nuclear weapons if the Russians invade Ukraine. Look, do they have the capacity? In the short term, no. There are things that the U.S. can only provide at sufficient scale, and in some cases that only the U.S. can provide. Over the long term, yes, the Europeans certainly have the capacity to do this. In terms of political will, look, the Europeans have to reckon with realities. And the realities are that they have hard choices here. Hopefully, President Trump will realize that President Putin is not going to give him a deal that is actually something that he should accept. In the past, President Trump has said that if that happens, he will lean into supporting Ukraine. I think prognosticating about exactly what President Trump is going to do in concrete situations is a fool's game, and I'm not going to engage in it. So I'm not prepared to be dispositive about that one way or the other.
I'm not asking you to do that. I'm asking you whether or not the Europeans have, as a matter of resources and will, again, let's just assume the Americans are not involved, do they have the capability to do that in a way that would be satisfactory to the Ukrainians? In
the short term, no. In the longer term, the Europeans could if they choose to. And it's very much in the Europeans' interest to choose to do that, because their alternatives are going to be, if we posit the U.S. is not going to be supporting, then their alternatives are to choose to do that or to allow the Russians over time, possibly not that much time, to take and destroy Ukraine. And then the Russians will present a massive threat to the Europeans, which would be much more dangerous to them and cost a lot more.
Briefly on this minerals deal that seems to have been agreed and is going to be signed, and again, we don't have the full details of it, but what's your sense of what the scope of the Ukrainian resources are? I know President Trump was asking for access to $500 billion worth of resources. The reports I've read is that Ukraine may be able to produce $3 or $4 billion of these rare earth minerals in particular a year. We'd be talking about a 100-year plus kind of arrangement. What's your sense of the significance of this deal? Do you think it's a kind of symbolic thing so that President Trump can say, look, I'm getting some of our money back by agreeing sort of an economic consideration? Is it really meaningful?
Well, I think the argument of those who support the deal is that the deal invests the U.S. in Ukraine that is able to honor the agreement. Supporters of the deal argue that this creates an actual long-term major economic U.S. interest that the U.S. in principle should be willing to support and defend in Ukraine. I think that what is urgent right now is some of the things that are not in this deal, and in particular, questions about what the shape of continued provision of U.S. weapons to Ukraine is going to be. President Zelensky has said that this is something that he intends to raise with President Trump. It's very urgent. So if this deal is a precursor and prelude to a negotiation about something like that, then okay, that's fine. But from my perspective, as someone who's really focused on the war and on the military conditions that are going to need to be set in order to get to an enduring peace that is acceptable, I need to see the next set of discussions moving rapidly and positively before I can really evaluate the import of all of this.
Again, I very much appreciate you're focused on the war, but I know you're thought deeply about these issues, and I want to actually come on, before we conclude, to the wider question of NATO's role and function and capabilities from here on out. But what did you make of the US voting with Russia and North Korea and Belarus in the United Nations on the General Assembly resolution the other day, which essentially avoids blaming Russia for the war? Again, do you see this in tactical terms, or do you think there's a broader strategic shift in US policy going on?
Well, I certainly hope that it was tactical and that it's not a broader strategic shift. And I think that any time the United States finds itself voting with Russia and North Korea on a resolution that China and Iran abstain from, it's a bad thing.
That point about NATO, I spent some time last week in Europe and spoke to several British and other European government officials. Obviously, many of them have seen something like this coming for some time and certainly weren't completely taken aback after Trump's election that something like this would happen. But even they, I think, were a bit surprised. We saw the result of the German election at the weekend, and we saw the man who is likely to be the chancellor saying essentially that Europe can now really no longer depend on the US as a kind of reliable member of NATO. Is NATO essentially dead or dying?
NATO isn't dead. I don't think it's dying. I think it's going through a period of tremendous strain. And I think that the U.S. administration is currently doing is obviously adding considerably to that strain. We should not give up on NATO. NATO has been the most successful alliance in history. It's the most important security arrangement the United States has, and it's vital to the security of Europe. So I hope and dare to expect that the alliance will come through this crisis, and that it will come through this crisis stronger and with a much deeper European commitment to invest in its own defense and to become more independent of the United States in terms of security. I think that that actually benefits the United States as well as Europe and will contribute to stability in the world. So I think it's a good thing for Europe to do anyway. I don't want to minimize in any way the crisis. This is one of the worst crises the alliance has ever faced. But I think it's premature to be posting the obituary for NATO.
On Russia, you hear this a lot, particularly, unexpectedly these days, but in Republican circles, didn't expect to hear this. But why should the United States be concerned about Russia? The United States has got the big strategic challenge in the Pacific to worry about. We live in a more multipolar world these days than we did 25 years ago. Europe's wealthy, got tremendous resources, has lived off essentially the US guarantee for ages. What's the actual national security interest for the United States of preventing Russia from achieving its aims in Ukraine? Again, J.D. Vance refers to it as either a territorial dispute or a dispute among ethnicities. Why should we care about it in America, care about stopping Russia from achieving its strategic objectives?
Because Putin's objectives transcend Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine. Putin's project is the restoration of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Conquering Ukraine is a critical component of that. Russian strength and Russian ability to threaten Europe and the United States varies enormously depending on the outcome of this war. Putin is an enemy of the United States. Putin says that. And his project is to cut the United States down to size from his perspective, to expel us from Europe and to confine us to being a Western hemispheric power while he takes what he regards as Russia's rightful place, dominating all of Eastern Europe and fundamentally dictating the way that Europe functions. That's not in the United States' interest. The economic order that Putin is going to create is not in our interest. The security structures that Putin is going to create and destroy are not in our interest. And at the same time that Putin is doing all of this, he's deepening his relationships with other U.S. enemies, North Korea, Iran, China. He's working very hard to forge that quartet into something solid that has the project of destroying the world that the United States built and from which Americans prosper more than any other people in the world. So there is a lot at stake here for the United States. And this is not just about helping Ukraine, and it never was just about helping Ukraine. The U.S. has vital national security interests here. And we really do need to begin focusing a bit more on that. But that starts with recognizing what Putin's project actually is. And it is a very broad project, and it is a fundamentally anti-American project.
Fred Kagan, military historian, thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for Free Expression this week. Thanks very much indeed for joining me. I'll be back again next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.